The first transmission crackled through static at 3:47 hours, barely audible above the mountain wind whistling through the communications tower. Control, this is Vanguard 77, requesting immediate vector to Tango 95. The voice belonged to Squadron Leader Kestrel Thorne, though none of the controllers knew her real name yet. What they heard was confidence wrapped in exhaustion, authority bleeding through equipment failure. Her F-16C Fighting Falcon limped through Pakistani airspace, hydraulics failing, fuel bleeding from punctured lines, navigation systems flickering between life and death. But something was wrong with the transmission. The accent was off, too crisp, too measured for standard NATO protocol. Intelligence analysts would later discover the aircraft's identification had been scrubbed, its squadron markings painted over with hasty brushstrokes that couldn't quite hide the ghost of different insignia underneath. The mystery deepened when radar operators noticed her flight pattern, deliberate, almost choreographed, as if she were drawing something invisible across the sky. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Wraith, stationed at Jacobabad Air Base, studied the blinking dot on his scope with growing unease. 23 years of service had taught him to recognize patterns, and this pilot was flying like someone who knew these mountains intimately. "Sir," his radar operator whispered, "she's not following standard ingress routes. She's taking the old smuggler paths." Wraith's jaw tightened. Those routes hadn't been used since the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, known only to pilots with decades of regional experience or access to classified historical flight data. The JF-17 Thunder interceptors launched at dawn, their Chinese-Pakistani hybrid engines screaming across the Balochistan plateau. Captain Zahir Malik led the formation, his aircraft's nose art depicting a striking cobra with emerald eyes. "Contact bearing 270, 15 miles and closing," he radioed to his wingman. "Unknown F-16, you are in violation of restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately." Kestrel's response came through crystal clear this time, and something in her voice made Zahir hesitate. "Thunder Lead, this is Vanguard 77. I'm declaring emergency status. My bird's dying and I need safe passage to friendly territory." There was a pause, filled only by the whisper of wind across aircraft surfaces 30,000 feet above the earth. Then, almost as an afterthought, "And Zahir, tell your mother Captain Thorne sends her regards." The Pakistani pilot's blood froze. Nobody outside his immediate family knew his mother's connection to foreign military advisors. Nobody except the American instructor pilot who had saved her life during the earthquake relief operations 15 years ago. Kestrel Thorne was coming home, and someone very powerful wanted her dead before she could tell the world what she had discovered in the mountains where three nations' secrets converged like storm fronts in an endless sky. The hunt was about to begin, and the prey knew the terrain better than her predators ever imagined. Through her cracked canopy, she could see the JF-17s positioning for intercept, their sleek forms cutting through morning light like predatory birds. But Kestrel smiled grimly, her gloved hands steady on controls that had carried her through missions no official record would ever acknowledge. She had painted something in the clouds above these mountains once before, something that had changed the course of a secret war. Today, she would paint it again, and this time the whole world would see the crest that marked her as both hunter and hunted in the deadly game of nations. The game was about to change forever. "Control, Vanguard 77 is going dark. See you on the other side." Her transmission cut to static, leaving only the mountain wind and the approaching thunder of hostile aircraft closing in on a ghost who refused to stay buried. Captain Zahir Malik watched his heads-up display track the American fighter as she dove toward the canyon system known locally as the Devil's Throat. His wingman, Lieutenant Farid Hassan, maintained formation off his starboard wing, both JF-17s configured for air-to-air intercept with full missile loadouts. "Thunder Lead, contact is descending rapidly toward the restricted zone," Farid reported, his voice tight with concentration. "She's flying like she knows exactly where she's going." The restricted zone. Even Zahir felt a chill at those words. The mountainous region straddling the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, where drone strikes had eliminated high-value targets for over a decade, where special operations forces conducted missions that never appeared in official briefings. His orders were explicit: prevent any aircraft from reaching the zone, use deadly force if necessary. But something about this pilot's voice, her knowledge of his family, made him hesitate on the trigger. Unknown F-16, you are approaching restricted airspace, Zahir transmitted. Alter course immediately or we will engage. He armed his PL-15 air-to-air missiles, their seeker heads coming online with electronic chirps that translated to death sentences in multiple languages. Through his canopy, he could see the American fighter weaving between mountain peaks with impossible precision, using terrain masking that should have been beyond the capabilities of someone unfamiliar with local geography. Kestrel's F-16 dropped below radar coverage, disappearing into the maze of valleys and ridgelines that had swallowed armies throughout history. Her aircraft's stealth modifications, added during black budget programs that existed only in whispered conversations between intelligence officials, helped her become a ghost in the machine. But she couldn't hide forever. The JF-17s had modern radar systems, Chinese-designed electronics that could penetrate most countermeasures if given enough time and the right approach vectors. Thunder 2, take high cover, Zahir ordered. I'm going down after her. His JF-17 nosed over into a steep descent, afterburners painting twin cones of superheated gas against the pale morning sky. The Pakistani pilot had logged over 2,000 hours in these mountains, conducting interdiction missions against smugglers and insurgents. He knew every valley, every peak, every hidden airstrip carved from rock and desperation. But as he descended toward the Devil's Throat, Zahir began to understand that he was hunting someone who knew these mountains differently, not as a predator seeking targets, but as someone who had once called them home. The American pilot was flying with the instinctive grace of someone who had learned to read wind patterns in canyon thermals, who understood how mountain shadows could hide aircraft signatures from even the most sophisticated sensors. His radar locked onto the F-16 as it emerged from behind a towering cliff face, and Zahir's finger moved to the missile release trigger. But something made him pause, a flash of sunlight off the American aircraft's wing that revealed paint beneath paint, ghost markings that spoke of a different allegiance, a different war. The woman flying that dying fighter had secrets written in scars across her aircraft's aluminum skin, secrets that someone with immense power wanted buried in these ancient mountains. Control, Thunder Lead has visual contact, Zahir reported, his voice steady despite the questions multiplying in his mind. Target is a single F-16C, heavily modified. Pilot appears to be flying defensive patterns. He didn't mention the strange familiarity he felt watching her maneuver, the way her aircraft moved like an extension of her, rather than a machine under mechanical control. Professional pilots recognized artistry when they saw it, and this woman was painting masterpieces in the thin air above the Hindu Kush. The chase was just beginning, and already Zahir suspected he was pursuing more than just an intruder. He was chasing a story that powerful people had tried very hard to erase. Lieutenant Farid Hassan maintained his patrol altitude, watching his flight leader's JF-17 disappear into the valley complex below. His mission was simple: provide top cover, prevent the American from escaping toward Afghan airspace, engage if ordered. But the young pilot couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much larger than a simple airspace violation. The way their target flew suggested intimate knowledge of local geography, the kind that came from extended operational deployment rather than intelligence briefings. Thunder Lead, Thunder 2, Farid transmitted. I have multiple radar contacts approaching from the east. Looks like a full squadron of F-16s, American markings, requesting permission to enter Pakistani airspace. He watched his display populate with friendly aircraft identifications, but something felt wrong about their approach vectors. These weren't search and rescue birds coming to help a downed pilot. They were flying in attack formation, loaded for combat. In the valley below, Kestrel fought to keep her damaged Fighting Falcon airborne. Hydraulic fluid painted crimson streaks across her canopy, and her left engine ran rough, temperature gauges creeping toward the red line. She had maybe 20 minutes of flight time remaining before catastrophic system failure forced an ejection over terrain that offered few survivable landing zones. But 20 minutes might be enough if she could reach the coordinates burned into her memory 15 years ago. The coordinates where she had buried something that could topple governments. "Thunder Lead, be advised, we have company coming," she transmitted to Zahir on an open frequency. Her voice carried a note of grim satisfaction that made the Pakistani pilot's skin crawl. "Your government might want to ask my government why they're so eager to kill one of their own pilots over your airspace." She pulled her F-16 into a climbing turn that should have been impossible with her damaged control systems, rising out of the valley like smoke given deadly form. Zahir watched her emerge from the terrain and finally got a clear visual on her aircraft's condition. Bullet holes peppered the fuselage, missile damage had shredded her starboard wing, and jury-rigged repairs held critical systems together with what looked like maintenance wire and aviation prayers. This pilot hadn't just survived combat, she had survived betrayal, had fought her way through friendly forces trying to silence her permanently. "Control, Thunder Lead," Zahir transmitted to his base. "Request immediate clarification on rules of engagement. American F-16 appears to be fleeing from pursuit by other American aircraft. This may be a defection or asylum situation." He armed his weapons but didn't achieve missile lock, buying time while his government decided whether Pakistan wanted to be complicit in whatever shadow war was playing out above their territory. The response came back encrypted, decoded through systems that bore Chinese manufacturing stamps and American software signatures, a technological metaphor for the delicate balance of alliances that governed South Asian geopolitics. "Thunder Lead, you are ordered to prevent any aircraft from reaching grid reference Tango 7 Alpha 9. Use all necessary force. Foreign Ministry is handling diplomatic protests." Grid reference Tango 7 Alpha 9. The coordinates that didn't exist on any official map, that appeared only in classified flight plans for missions that left no paper trail. Zahir felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place as he realized both the American pilot and his own government were converging on the same location for very different reasons. "Thunder Lead copies," he acknowledged, then switched to the emergency frequency. "Unknown F-16, you are ordered to divert immediately. I don't want to shoot you down, but I have my orders." Kestrel's laugh came through crystal clear, filled with bitter understanding. "Captain Malik, you're a good pilot and a better man than the people giving you orders, but some things are worth dying for. Tell your children their grandfather's sacrifice in the earthquake wasn't forgotten." Zahir's world shifted on its axis, as memories 15 years buried suddenly surfaced with perfect clarity. The earthquake had struck at 3:52 hours local time, a magnitude 7.6 monster that turned mountains into avalanches and cities into graveyards. Captain Kestrel Thorne, then a young F-16 pilot on her first overseas deployment, had been conducting a routine training flight when the emergency frequencies exploded with distress calls from across northern Pakistan. Her squadron leader ordered immediate return to base, but Kestrel had already spotted something that changed the calculus of duty versus orders. A Pakistani army helicopter, overloaded with injured civilians, was auto-rotating toward a crash landing in terrain that offered no survival possibilities. The pilot was fighting a losing battle against rotor failure and mountain winds, his aircraft carrying twice its safe passenger load, because leaving anyone behind meant certain death in the collapse zones below. Standard protocol prohibited direct intervention in foreign military operations. International law forbade American aircraft from conducting rescue missions in Pakistani airspace without explicit government approval that would take hours to obtain while people died in the wreckage. But Kestrel Thorne had never been particularly concerned with standard protocol when lives hung in the balance. Her F-16 carried external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned for emergency use, and she knew the Pakistani helicopter's fuel consumption rates from joint training exercises. What she didn't know was that the helicopter pilot fighting to save his passengers was Zahir's grandfather, retired Colonel Ahmed Malik, who had volunteered his personal aircraft for civilian rescue operations when the military's resources proved insufficient. "Paxet rescue helicopter, this is Vanguard 77, she had transmitted, using call signs that would be sanitized from official records within hours. I am dropping external fuel tanks at your current position. Use them to reach safe landing zone, coordinates to follow." Her F-16 descended to dangerous altitude, jettisoning fuel pods with precise placement that spoke of countless hours practicing for scenarios that existed only in theoretical emergency manuals. Colonel Malik's voice had crackled through the international emergency frequency, speaking accented English learned during peacekeeping deployments to Bosnia. "American pilot, I cannot accept military assistance without authorization from Islamabad." But even as he spoke, his helicopter was settling toward the fuel canisters with the desperate precision of someone who understood that protocol was a luxury the dying couldn't afford. "Sir, I'm not military assistance," Kestrel had replied, her F-16 maintaining a protective orbit around the crash site. "I'm just a pilot who happened to be in the neighborhood when people needed help. Take the fuel, save your passengers, and we'll let the diplomats sort out the paperwork later." The fuel transfer had taken 18 minutes. 18 minutes during which Kestrel violated every regulation in the book, while Colonel Malik's helicopter refueled from improvised pumps operated by survivors who understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Two nations, military pilots working together without orders, without permission, without any authority beyond the simple recognition that some duties transcended the boundaries drawn by politicians and generals. Colonel Malik had successfully evacuated 43 civilians that day, including Zahir's mother, who had been trapped in a collapsed school where she taught children from 3 different ethnic communities. The official record showed routine training flights and standard search and rescue operations. No mention was made of an American pilot who risked her career to save Pakistani lives, or the Pakistani colonel who accepted help from former enemies, because the earthquake had made all distinctions irrelevant except the one between living and dead. But Colonel Malik remembered, and when his grandson entered pilot training 15 years later, he told stories about the American pilot who painted courage in the sky above disaster zones, who understood that honor was measured not by adherence to regulations, but by willingness to risk everything for strangers. Now that grandson watched Kestrel Thorne's battle-damaged F-16 climbing toward the same mountain where his grandfather had learned to measure Americans by their actions rather than their flag. The woman who had saved his family was asking for safe passage through airspace he was ordered to defend with deadly force. The irony was sharp enough to cut through armor plating. "Control, Thunder Lead," Zahir transmitted, his voice carefully neutral. "American aircraft is continuing toward restricted zone, requesting permission to use warning shots only." He was buying time, hoping his superiors would recognize the diplomatic complexities of shooting down a pilot whose actions had saved Pakistani lives in international headlines 15 years ago. But the response carried the weight of decisions made far above his pay grade. "Thunder Lead, you are ordered to prevent any aircraft from reaching the restricted zone by any means necessary. Foreign pressure is irrelevant. This is a matter of national security." National security, the phrase that justified everything and explained nothing, that transformed heroes into targets when their knowledge became inconvenient to powerful interests. Zahir understood now that he wasn't hunting a rogue American pilot. He was enforcing the silence that kept uncomfortable truths buried in classified files and unmarked graves. His radar warning receiver suddenly came alive with threat signals, as the approaching American F-16s achieved missile lock on his aircraft. He was caught between his own orders and aircraft that bore the same flag as the woman he was supposed to shoot down. The situation had evolved from airspace violation to potential international incident, and Zahir found himself at the center of conflicts that stretched far beyond the mountains of Pakistan. Vanguard 77, he transmitted to Kestrel on the emergency frequency. I need to understand what's in that restricted zone that's worth starting a war over. Her response came back immediately, carrying 15 years of secrets in every word. Captain Malik, it's not what's in the zone. It's what I buried there to keep it out of the wrong hands. And now those wrong hands are coming to dig it up. The hunt was becoming something else entirely. A race against time and politics to recover evidence that powerful people had spent years ensuring would never see daylight. Kestrel's damaged F-16 crossed into the restricted zone at 4:12 hours, her aircraft leaving a thin trail of hydraulic fluid that caught morning sunlight like drops of blood across golden sky. Behind her, Zahir's JF-17 maintained pursuit while American fighters approached from multiple vectors, their intentions becoming clearer with each passing minute. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a containment operation designed to ensure that whatever secrets Kestrel carried would die with her in the mountains that had already swallowed so many classified operations. The terrain below told stories in geological layers and human scars. Soviet tank tracks still marked valley floors where the Red Army had learned the futility of conquering Afghanistan's mountains. American drone strikes had left precise craters where high-value targets had been eliminated with surgical violence. Pakistani military outposts crowned strategic peaks, their positions marking the complex choreography of a three-way shadow war that officially didn't exist. But there was something else hidden in these mountains, something that predated the current conflicts and connected to operations that had shaped regional politics for decades. Kestrel banked her failing fighter toward coordinates that existed only in her memory, numbers that represented a grave she had dug with her own hands 15 years ago when idealism died hard enough to leave shrapnel in her soul. Thunder lead, target is approaching rally point 7, Lieutenant Hassan reported from his high cover position. American fighters are moving to intercept, ETA 4 minutes. His young voice carried the strain of watching his country's airspace become a battleground between forces he didn't understand, conflicts that reduced pilots to chess pieces in games played by intelligence agencies and defense contractors. Zahir checked his fuel status and weapons load, calculating engagement parameters against multiple hostiles, while trying to understand why his government wanted one particular location defended with deadly force. Rally Point 7 existed on classified maps as a simple grid reference, but operational pilots learned to read between the lines of briefings that explained everything except what actually mattered. Vanguard 77, you need to tell me what's down there, he transmitted to Kestrel. If I'm going to die protecting Pakistani airspace, I want to know what I'm really protecting. Kestrel's F-16 dropped into a steep descent toward a valley that appeared unremarkable from altitude, just another fold in terrain that had hidden smugglers, refugees, and ghosts for centuries. But her navigation was precise to the meter, guided by landmarks that included a distinctive rock formation locals called the Eagle's Claw and a seasonal stream that ran red with iron deposits when mountain snows melted. 15 years ago, I was part of a joint task force hunting Taliban leadership in this region, she transmitted, her voice carrying the weight of classified history that lived in the gap between official records and operational reality. We found something that wasn't supposed to exist, evidence of weapons transactions that involved American officials and Pakistani intelligence services, deals that funded black operations on both sides of the border. The first American F-16 appeared on Zahir's radar scope, climbing hard from Afghan airspace with missiles armed and targeting systems active. Its pilot transmitted standard warnings about unauthorized aircraft in international airspace, but the tone suggested someone following orders rather than someone concerned about airspace violations. The problem wasn't the weapons deals themselves, Kestrel continued, her aircraft now weaving between valley walls that rose like stone cathedrals around her flight path. The problem was that some of those weapons ended up being used against American forces, and some of the intelligence we shared was passed to Taliban commanders who used it to set ambushes. People died because powerful men in both our countries decided profit mattered more than the lives of soldiers they were supposed to protect. Zahir felt the pieces of a larger conspiracy falling into place as he understood why both American and Pakistani authorities wanted this woman silenced. She possessed evidence of betrayals that could topple governments and destroy the careers of officials who had built their reputations on the graves of subordinates they had sacrificed for political convenience. I copied everything to insurance files and buried the physical evidence in a location I thought no one would find, Kestrel transmitted. But intelligence services have long memories and longer reach. They've spent 15 years hunting me, transferring me to increasingly dangerous assignments, hoping I'd die gloriously in combat before I could reveal what I know. The American F-16s were now close enough for visual identification, their aircraft bearing the markings of a squadron that technically didn't exist, pilots whose names appeared on no official rosters, but whose expertise in eliminating problems had been refined through decades of plausible deniability. They were closing on Kestrel with the methodical precision of executioners following a script written by people who confused patriotism with covering their tracks. "Thunder Lead, you are ordered to stand down immediately," came a transmission from the lead American aircraft. "We are conducting a classified recovery operation in coordination with Pakistani authorities. Your interference is not required." But Zahir had received no orders about American recovery operations, and his training had taught him to be suspicious of coordination, that nobody bothered to coordinate with the pilots expected to provide it. He checked his secure communications channel and found orders that contradicted everything the Americans were claiming, orders that suggested his government was as surprised by this development as he was. The valley opened ahead of Kestrel's damaged fighter, revealing a hidden airstrip carved from rock and maintained by people who needed aircraft to land where officially no aircraft ever landed. She lined up for an approach that would have been challenging in perfect aircraft with full flight controls. In her battle-damaged F-16 with failing hydraulics and jury-rigged systems, it represented a choice between probable death and certain death. "Captain Malik," she transmitted to Zahir, "in 30 seconds I'm going to be on the ground and defenseless. Those American fighters aren't here to rescue me. They're here to eliminate a problem their superiors should have handled 15 years ago. You can let them finish their mission, or you can help me live long enough to show the world what its heroes really died fighting for." Through his canopy, Zahir could see her F-16 dropping toward the valley floor, her approach angle calculated with the desperate precision of someone who had run out of alternatives. Behind him, American fighters were achieving missile lock with electronic tones that translated to execution orders in any language. The moment of decision had arrived, and Captain Zahir Malik realized that sometimes the choice between following orders and doing the right thing was the same choice his grandfather had faced 15 years ago when an American pilot offered fuel to save Pakistani lives. This time, a Pakistani pilot had the opportunity to return the favor. Kestrel's F-16 touched down on the improvised airstrip with a screech of tires against stone that echoed off valley walls like a scream. Her aircraft rolled to a stop beside maintenance equipment that had been abandoned so long that mountain vegetation was reclaiming metal and concrete. She shut down her dying engines and began the emergency egress procedures drilled into every pilot's muscle memory, knowing she had perhaps 90 seconds before the American fighters arrived to complete their mission. The burial site lay 200 meters from the airstrip, marked by a cairn of stones that local tradition said would bring bad luck to anyone who disturbed them. 15 years ago, Kestrel had added her own stones to the pile before burying a waterproof container that held enough evidence to destroy careers, topple governments, and perhaps explain why so many good soldiers had died in operations that official reports described as successful. Above her, Zahir's JF-17 banked into an intercept course with the approaching American fighters, his aircraft's radar painting target locks on former allies who had become enemies through the simple expedient of choosing political convenience over moral consistency. His radio crackled with confused transmissions from Pakistani controllers who were trying to understand why American aircraft were conducting combat operations in Pakistani airspace without notification or authorization. "Thunder lead, break off immediately," transmitted the lead American F-16. "You are interfering with a classified operation authorized at the highest levels of both governments." But Zahir had learned to recognize lies wrapped in official language, having grown up listening to his grandfather's stories about politicians who sent other men's children to die for causes they wouldn't risk their own careers defending. "American lead, I have no record of authorized operations in this airspace. You are ordered to exit Pakistani territory immediately." The first missile launch lit up Zahir's threat warning systems with electronic screams that meant someone had decided talking was finished. He pulled his JF-17 into a defensive spiral, dispensing chaff and flares, while his aircraft's Chinese-designed countermeasures fought to confuse American-built seekers in a technological battle that metaphored the larger conflicts tearing apart regional alliances built on mutual mistrust and competing interests. On the ground, Kestrel ran through ankle-deep dust toward the cairn, her flight suit heavy with survival gear, and the weight of 15 years carrying secrets that had eaten through her soul like acid through armor plating. She could hear jet engines overhead, the distinctive whine of afterburners pushed to military power, as pilots fought for position in three-dimensional chess games where losing meant death and winning meant living with the knowledge of what victory had cost. The stones came away easily, revealing desert sand that had preserved the metal container exactly as she had left it. Inside, encrypted hard drives held terabytes of classified communications, financial records, and operational reports that documented the intersection of American black operations and Pakistani intelligence services in transactions that violated every treaty, regulation, and moral principle both nations claimed to uphold. But the evidence had value only if she lived to present it, and the sound of approaching helicopters suggested her enemies had prepared for the possibility that airstrikes might not be sufficient to eliminate the problem she represented. They were bringing ground forces to ensure the job was completed with characteristic thoroughness. Zahir's JF-17 emerged from its defensive spiral with an American AIM-120 missile climbing after it, the advanced seeker head tracking through countermeasures with electronic persistence that left little room for pilot error. He pulled maximum G-forces while transmitting rapid-fire updates to Pakistani air defense systems that were suddenly discovering unknown aircraft throughout their operational area. The missile detonated close enough to shower his aircraft with shrapnel that starred his canopy and sent warning lights cascading across his instrument panel. But the JF-17 remained flyable, its Chinese-Pakistani engineering proving resilient enough to absorb combat damage that would have destroyed earlier-generation fighters. Zahir rolled inverted and dove toward the valley floor, using terrain masking to break radar locks while calculating engagement parameters against adversaries who possessed superior technology but inferior knowledge of local geography. "All Thunder elements, this is Thunder lead," he transmitted on the squadron frequency. "We are under attack by unidentified American aircraft. Request immediate reinforcement and clarification of rules of engagement." The response carried the bureaucratic confusion of military organizations trying to understand conflicts that developed faster than policy could adapt. "Thunder lead, American Embassy denies any military operations in your area. You are authorized to defend Pakistani airspace by any means necessary. Which meant his government was washing their hands of whatever happened next, while giving him permission to start a war if he judged the circumstances warranted it. Zahir armed his own missiles and began stalking the Americans through mountain valleys, where his aircraft's smaller size and superior maneuverability provided advantages that partially offset their technological superiority. Below him, Kestrel reached her extraction point just as the first helicopter gunship appeared above the valley rim, its door gunners already acquiring targets through thermal imaging systems that turned human beings into heat signatures suitable for elimination. She triggered the emergency beacon that would transmit encrypted burst communications to journalists and intelligence officials in 7 countries, ensuring that her evidence would survive even if she didn't. The race between revelation and elimination had entered its final phase, and the mountains that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires prepared to host another battle between truth and the powerful interests that preferred certain truths remain buried with their victims. The helicopter gunship's thermal imagery revealed Kestrel's position with surgical precision, but the pilot hesitated as his targeting systems identified a lone figure beside what appeared to be an archaeological site. Standing orders emphasized the need for plausible deniability, and machine gunning an unarmed woman beside a traditional burial ground would generate the kind of video footage that could destroy careers and topple administrations. Groundhog 6, this is Overwatch, transmitted the mission commander from a circling aircraft invisible to ground observers. Target is to be taken alive if possible. We need confirmation of what intelligence she may have transmitted before elimination is authorized. But Kestrel had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, and her extraction plan included contingencies that intelligence services had failed to anticipate. The emergency beacon continued transmitting encrypted bursts that painted targeting information for assets positioned throughout the region. Assets that included Pakistani military units, whose loyalty belonged to officers who remembered when Americans died beside them in operations that created bonds stronger than political convenience. Captain Zahir banked his damaged JF-17 around a mountain peak and found himself behind the American helicopter. Its crew focused on ground operations, while their aircraft presented a perfect target for air-to-ground missiles designed to eliminate precisely this type of threat. His finger moved to the weapon release trigger, but training held him back from crossing the line between defending airspace and committing acts of war that would escalate far beyond the mountains of Pakistan. Instead, he activated his targeting radar and painted the helicopter with electronic emissions that every aircrew member would recognize as the prelude to missile launch. Unknown helicopter, you are in violation of Pakistani airspace. Depart immediately or I will engage with deadly force. The helicopter's crew chief responded with the practiced calm of someone who had survived multiple deployments to places where survival depended on making correct decisions under impossible pressure. Pakistani fighter, we are conducting a classified recovery operation. Stand down or face the consequences. But the consequences were already cascading through military and political hierarchies, as encrypted communications revealed the true scope of operations that had been hidden from oversight committees and allied governments. Kestrel's insurance files were being opened by journalists who specialized in national security investigations, by congressional staffers who asked inconvenient questions about classified budgets, by Pakistani intelligence officers who were learning that their American counterparts had been playing multiple games with the same deck of cards. Thunder Lead, this is Thunder 2, transmitted Lieutenant Hassan from his high cover position. I have visual on multiple inbound aircraft, mixed American and unknown registry. This looks like a full-scale operation, not a simple recovery mission. The valley was becoming a convergence point for forces that included American Special Operations helicopters, Pakistani military aircraft responding to distress calls, an unidentified aircraft that appeared on no flight plans but carried sophisticated electronic warfare equipment designed to jam communications and manipulate sensor systems. The hidden airstrip that had served smugglers and intelligence operatives for decades was about to become the focal point of a confrontation that could reshape regional alliances. On the ground, Kestrel heard the distinctive sound of fast-rope deployment as special operations soldiers began descending from helicopters toward her position. Their equipment and tactics identified them as American military personnel, but their mission put them in direct conflict with a fellow American whose only crime had been refusing to let evidence of high-level corruption remain buried with the soldiers who had died because of it. She activated the secondary beacon that transmitted on frequencies monitored by international media organizations and congressional oversight committees, ensuring that whatever happened in the next few minutes would be witnessed by audiences beyond the control of intelligence agencies specializing in plausible deniability. The truth was now beyond the reach of elimination operations, replicated across servers in multiple countries, and protected by journalists who understood that some stories were worth dying for. This is Captain Kestrel Thorne, United States Air Force, transmitting from coordinates that will be included in this signal. She spoke into the emergency recorder that would preserve her final testimony. I'm about to be killed by American forces to prevent revelation of evidence documenting weapons trafficking and intelligence sharing that resulted in American military deaths. The evidence has been transmitted to multiple recipients and will be released regardless of my survival. The soldiers were now close enough that she could see their faces, young men following orders that would haunt their dreams if they lived long enough to understand what they were really fighting for. Above them, Captain Zahir Malik made the decision that would define the rest of his career and possibly his life. He fired a warning burst across the helicopter's flight path, his JF-17s cannon shells exploding against rocks in a display that communicated his intentions with unmistakable clarity. The Pakistani pilot had chosen sides in a conflict that transcended nationality and ideology, a choice between following orders and defending principles that both nations claimed to represent. The helicopter gunship pulled back from immediate attack position, but more aircraft were approaching from multiple vectors. The battle for truth was about to begin in earnest, and the mountains would soon echo with the sound of justice and betrayal meeting in combat above ancient stones that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires built on lies. The second wave of helicopters appeared over the eastern ridge, just as Zahir's wingman, Lieutenant Hassan, reported fuel status approaching minimum reserves. The young Pakistani pilot had maintained high cover throughout the engagement, but his JF-17's smaller fuel capacity compared to the F-16s meant he would soon be forced to return to base or risk flameout over hostile territory. Thunder 2, RTB when you reach minimum fuel, Zahir transmitted, using the standard abbreviation for return to base, while privately hopping his wingman would live to tell accurate reports of whatever happened in this valley. I'm staying until this situation is resolved. Below, the American Special Operations Team had established a perimeter around the burial site, their positions expertly chosen to provide overlapping fields of fire while minimizing exposure to aircraft overhead. Their team leader, a major whose name appeared on no official rosters, communicated through encrypted channels with command authorities who were monitoring the situation through satellite feeds and drone coverage. Phoenix Base, Phoenix 6, the major transmitted. Target secured, but situation has escalated beyond original parameters. Pakistani military is actively interfering with recovery operations. Request clarification of rules of engagement. The response carried the weight of decisions being made in secure conference rooms thousands of miles away, where political appointees and career intelligence officials calculated the costs of revelation against the risks of escalation. Phoenix 6, Mission parameters remain unchanged. Secure the target and eliminate all evidence of operational compromise. Collateral damage is authorized if necessary to maintain mission security. Collateral damage, the bureaucratic euphemism that transformed people into statistics and war crimes into acceptable losses in the service of national security. Major Phillips, his real name was classified, but his mother had called him David before the Army gave him a dozen different identities, had spent 23 years following orders that gradually eroded the distinction between protecting America and protecting the people who sent Americans to die for their mistakes. Kestrel stood beside the cairn with her hands visible but not raised, understanding that sudden movements would trigger reflexes trained by decades of combat in places where hesitation meant death. "Major, I know you're following orders, but you need to understand what those orders really mean," she called out, her voice carrying across the desert air with the authority of someone who had commanded respect in cockpits and briefing rooms around the world. "Ma'am, you need to step away from that location and surrender any materials you may have recovered," Phillips responded, his weapon trained but not yet targeted, buying time while his men established positions that would make resistance futile. Behind his tactical visor, he studied the woman who had led them on a chase across 3 countries and through classified operations that existed only in redacted files and intelligence budgets hidden within defense appropriations. She looked older than her service record indicated, aged by 15 years of carrying secrets that had transformed idealism into bitter knowledge of how democratic nations preserved their innocence by forgetting their crimes. Her flight suit bore the stains of hydraulic fluid and cordite, evidence of combat against forces that should have been providing support rather than trying to eliminate an inconvenient witness to institutional betrayal. "The materials have already been transmitted," Kestrel replied, gesturing toward the emergency beacon that continued broadcasting encrypted signals to recipients around the world. "Killing me won't put that particular genie back in its bottle, but it will add one more crime to a list that's already long enough to destroy everyone from the Pentagon to Langley." Above them, Zahir's JF-17s circled at minimum altitude, his aircraft's fuel status approaching critical levels, while he monitored radio communications that painted a picture of American military units operating without Pakistani authorization in violation of treaties that had taken decades to negotiate. His orders were clear: defend Pakistani sovereignty against all threats. But the implications of engaging American forces extended far beyond military tactics into diplomatic consequences that could reshape regional alliances. The sound of additional helicopters approaching from the south indicated that Pakistani military forces were responding to the incursion, transforming what had begun as a covert elimination operation into a potential international incident with casualties on both sides. Major Phillips checked his tactical display and saw Pakistani Army aviation units inbound with estimated arrival in 12 minutes. Not enough time to complete extraction and eliminate evidence, but enough time for the situation to escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. "Phoenix Base, Phoenix 6, he transmitted. "Situation is deteriorating rapidly. Pakistani military response is imminent. Request immediate extraction authorization." But the response revealed the cruel mathematics of plausible deniability that governed black operations conducted in the gray zones between war and peace. "Phoenix 6, extraction is not authorized until mission completion. You are expendable if necessary to maintain operational security." Expendable, the word that every special operations soldier understood but never expected to hear applied to themselves, the designation that transformed heroes into liability when their knowledge became inconvenient to the people who had sent them into harm's way. Phillips felt the ground shift beneath his tactical situation as he realized that his team had become loose ends in an operation designed to eliminate loose ends. "Major," Kestrel called out, her voice carrying new urgency, those Pakistani helicopters aren't coming to rescue me. They're coming to secure evidence that proves their intelligence services were as compromised as ours. You and your men are about to become collateral damage in a cover-up that involves both governments." The implications struck Phillips like physical blows, as he understood that his mission had evolved beyond eliminating a whistleblower into containing an international scandal that could topple administrations in two nuclear-armed nations. The evidence Kestrel had buried documented corruption that extended through both American and Pakistani intelligence hierarchies, creating mutual vulnerability that made elimination of witnesses a shared interest rather than a national one. His tactical radio crackled with new communications as Pakistani Special Forces units coordinated their approach to the valley, their transmissions revealing operational knowledge that should have been impossible without access to American intelligence briefings. The cover-up involved Pakistani officials who had as much to lose from revelation as their American counterparts, creating temporary alliance between former enemies united by fear of accountability. Zahir's voice cut through the tactical chatter on the emergency frequency, his transmission directed toward all forces converging on the valley. "All aircraft, this is Pakistani Air Force Thunder Lead. I am declaring this airspace closed to all military operations pending clarification of authorization. Any hostile action against Pakistani sovereignty will be met with appropriate response." The Pakistani pilot was drawing a line in the sky above his country's mountains, forcing American and Pakistani officials to choose between escalation and exposure. Either they would respect Pakistani airspace and abandon the elimination operation, or they would commit acts of war against an ally whose cooperation was essential for regional stability. But powerful people had invested too much in maintaining their secrets to accept exposure gracefully, and the sound of approaching aircraft suggested that escalation was preferable to accountability for those whose careers depended on keeping certain truths buried with their victims. Major Phillips made the decision that separated soldiers from politicians. He chose to protect his men rather than the people who considered them expendable. "All Phoenix elements, prepare for extraction," he ordered, lowering his weapon while calculating withdrawal routes that might allow his team to survive the next 30 minutes. The battle for truth was about to become a battle for survival, and the ancient stones that marked Kestrel's burial site would soon witness another chapter in the endless war between justice and the powerful interests that preferred their justice buried in unmarked graves. The Pakistani helicopters crested the valley rim like mechanical vultures, their door gunners scanning for targets through optics that transformed human beings into thermal signatures suitable for elimination. But something was wrong with their approach vectors. Instead of establishing overwatch positions that would support ground operations, they were taking attack formations that suggested their mission involved eliminating all witnesses rather than securing evidence. Captain Rashid Qureshi led the Pakistani Special Forces team, his Mi-17 helicopter-carrying soldier whose loyalty belonged to intelligence officials who had as much to lose from revelation as their American counterparts. 20-year veteran of operations that existed only in classified files, Qureshi understood that some missions required soldiers to choose between following orders and serving the interests that those orders supposedly protected. "Storm base, storm lead," he transmitted to his handlers. "American Special Operations Team is on site. Target appears to be cooperating. Request clarification of engagement priorities." The response revealed the international scope of the cover-up that had brought military forces from two allied nations into conflict over evidence that could destroy careers and topple governments. "Storm lead, mission parameters are clear. Secure all evidence and eliminate all potential witnesses. International complications are acceptable to maintain operational security." All potential witnesses. The phrase that included American soldiers who had been following orders, Pakistani pilots who had been defending their airspace, and anyone else whose survival might complicate the narrative being constructed in secure conference rooms, where accountability was measured in terms of political convenience rather than human cost. Zahir's JF-17 banked toward the approaching Pakistani helicopters, his radio calls seeking clarification from controllers who seemed as confused about operational authority as he was. Control, Thunder lead requesting identification of inbound helicopters. No flight plan was filed for military operations in this sector. But the response carried the electronic signature of communications that had been routed through channels designed to obscure rather than clarify operational authority. Thunder lead, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Your presence is not required for ongoing operations. Not required. The dismissal that every pilot understood meant someone wanted him gone before he witnessed something that would compromise plausible deniability. Zahir checked his fuel gauge and calculated that he had perhaps 20 minutes of flight time remaining. 20 minutes to decide whether he would abandon the American pilot, who had saved his family, or remain to witness whatever happened when two nations' special forces converged on a woman, whose only crime had been refusing to let evidence of institutional betrayal remain buried. On the ground, Major Phillips watched the Pakistani helicopters establish landing zones, while his tactical display painted threat warnings from multiple directions. His team was caught between American extraction that wasn't coming and Pakistani forces whose intentions remained unclear, surrounded in a valley that offered few defensive positions and no escape routes suitable for ground movement. "Ma'am," he called to Kestrel, "I need to know exactly what evidence you transmitted and to whom. My men's lives may depend on understanding what we're really dealing with here." Kestrel's response carried 15 years of bitter experience, with operations that sacrificed soldiers to protect the politicians who had sent them into combat, without adequate support or honest justification. "Major, I transmitted financial records documenting weapons sales that funded both American black operations and Taliban insurgency. Communication intercepts proving that Pakistani intelligence passed American operational plans to enemy commanders, and casualty reports that were falsified to hide the fact that American soldiers died because their supposed allies were selling information to their enemies." The magnitude of betrayal struck Phillips like physical blows, as he understood that his career had been spent fighting enemies who possessed American intelligence provided by officials who profited from prolonging conflicts that should have ended years earlier. The soldiers under his command had risked their lives in operations that were compromised before they began, betrayed by people who measured success in terms of defense contracts and intelligence budgets rather than mission accomplishment and troop safety. "Jesus Christ," whispered Sergeant Martinez, his team's communications specialist, whose brother had died in an ambush in Afghanistan that now appeared to have been set up using intelligence provided by American officials to Pakistani services that passed it to Taliban commanders. "Sarge, if this is true, then Tommy died because some asshole in Washington was making money selling our locations to the people shooting at us." The human cost of institutional betrayal was becoming personal for soldiers who had believed they were fighting for democracy and freedom, rather than serving as expendable assets in games played by intelligence officials who confused patriotism with profit margins. The evidence Kestrel had transmitted threatened to expose not just individual corruption, but systematic betrayal that had turned Allied military cooperation into a marketplace where soldiers' lives were traded for political and financial advantage. Captain Qureshi's helicopter touched down 200 meters from the American position, his Special Forces team deploying with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had conducted similar operations throughout the region. But something was wrong with their equipment loadouts. Instead of standard assault configurations, they carried specialized gear designed for evidence destruction and site sanitization, suggesting their mission involved eliminating all traces of whatever had been buried in this valley. The ancient cairn seemed to watch over the convergence of forces whose presence validated its significance in ways that local tradition had never anticipated. Stones placed by travelers over centuries now marked the intersection of international conspiracies that stretched from Washington's corridors of power to Islamabad's intelligence headquarters, binding two nations in mutual vulnerability that made elimination of witnesses a shared necessity. Zahir's JF-17 passed low over the valley floor, his aircraft's cameras recording everything, while his fuel gauges approached critical levels that would soon force a choice between returning to base and risking flameout over hostile territory. Through his canopy, he could see soldiers from two allied nations converging on positions that suggested coordination, rather than conflict, temporary alliance between forces that should have been adversaries, but found common cause in containing evidence that threatened their respective chains of command. The battle for truth was about to become a battle between soldiers who had sworn oaths to protect their nations and officials who had perverted those oaths into protecting their own interests at the cost of the people they were supposed to serve. The silence that preceded violence settled over the valley like morning mist, broken only by the distant sound of rotor blades and the electronic whisper of tactical communications, as three military forces calculated engagement parameters against adversaries who had become enemies through the simple expedient of choosing institutional loyalty over moral consistency. In 30 seconds, the shooting would begin, and the mountains would echo with the sound of democracy devouring its own children to preserve the illusion of innocence. The first shot came from an unexpected direction, not from the converging military forces, but from a ridge overlooking the valley where a lone sniper had established position during the night. The bullet struck the ground between Kestrel and Major Phillips, sending up a puff of dust that communicated a simple message. Someone was watching with capabilities that neither American nor Pakistani forces had anticipated. All units, sniper fire from Ridge Line Alpha, Phillips transmitted, his team immediately adopting defensive positions while scanning for muzzle flashes that never came. Professional snipers learned to shoot and move, especially when their targets included Special Forces personnel trained to respond to sniper attacks with overwhelming firepower directed at suspected positions. But this sniper wasn't trying to kill anyone. The shot placement had been deliberately non-lethal, a warning rather than an attack. Through his scope, the hidden marksman watched the tableau below while transmitting encrypted updates to handlers whose identity existed only in classified files that documented operations conducted by people who officially didn't exist. Captain Qureshi's Pakistani forces had frozen at the sound of gunfire, their training recognizing that sniper fire meant someone with superior position, and unknown intentions had achieved tactical dominance over the entire valley. His radio crackled with confused transmissions from his headquarters as intelligence officials tried to understand who else might be operating in an area they thought they controlled. Storm lead, identify source of hostile fire, came the order from commanders who were discovering that their carefully orchestrated cover-up had attracted attention from additional players in games they didn't know they were playing. Neutralize any threats to mission security. But neutralizing threats required first identifying them, and the sniper had vanished as completely as smoke in mountain wind. Thermal imaging revealed nothing, electronic surveillance detected no communications, and visual scanning found only rocks and shadows that could hide a dozen marksmen or none at all. Zahir's JF-17 passed over the ridgeline where the shot had originated, his aircraft's sensors detecting nothing unusual in terrain that appeared empty of human presence. But his grandfather had taught him to read mountains the way other pilots read instruments, and something about the rock formations suggested artificial modification that might indicate prepared positions constructed by people who understood that certain operations required permanent overwatch. Thunder lead to all ground units, he transmitted on the emergency frequency. Be advised, you may be under observation by unknown forces. Recommend extreme caution with any aggressive actions. The warning carried implications that struck each commander with the force of revelation. They were operating in someone else's operational area, conducting missions that unknown adversaries had anticipated and prepared to counter. The valley that had seemed isolated and controllable was actually under surveillance by people whose capabilities and intentions remained completely mysterious. Kestrel understood before anyone else what the sniper shot represented, her 15 years of classified operations having taught her to recognize the signature of intelligence assets, positioned to protect operations that existed in the spaces between official policy and plausible deniability. Someone had been watching this valley for years, waiting for the day when buried evidence would attract the attention of people powerful enough to require permanent solutions. "Major," she called to Phillips, "that shot came from someone who's been here longer than any of us. This valley isn't as isolated as your intelligence briefings suggested." The implications cascaded through tactical considerations, as each commander realized that their carefully planned operations were being conducted under the observation of unknown forces, whose presence suggested that higher authorities had been playing deeper games than anyone at the operational level had been told. The cover-up was being covered up, secrets protected by additional layers of secrecy that extended beyond any single nation's intelligence services. Captain Qureshi's tactical display suddenly populated with new contacts, as his electronic warfare equipment detected communication signatures that didn't match any known Pakistani or American systems. Someone was broadcasting encrypted signals from multiple positions throughout the valley, coordinating activities that remained invisible to conventional surveillance, while maintaining overwatch on all military forces currently deployed. "Storm base, storm lead," he transmitted with growing unease. "We have unknown electronic signatures throughout the operational area. Possible hostile surveillance network is monitoring all activities." But the response revealed that his superiors were as surprised by these developments as he was, their carefully orchestrated elimination operation suddenly complicated by variables that no intelligence assessment had anticipated. "Storm lead, proceed with mission. Unknown contacts are not your concern." Not his concern. The dismissal that every experienced operator recognized as evidence that someone at higher levels was operating with information that wasn't being shared with the people expected to risk their lives implementing policies they weren't cleared to understand. The cover-up had multiple layers, each one designed to protect different interests, while ensuring that operational personnel remained expendable when their knowledge became inconvenient. The ancient stones of the cairn seemed to absorb the tension radiating from three military forces who were discovering that their missions had been compromised before they began, their carefully planned operations unfolding under the watchful eyes of people whose presence transformed elimination into exposure and secrecy into spectacle. In secure conference rooms thousands of miles away, officials who had ordered the cover-up were learning that certain secrets had acquired their own protective services, intelligence assets positioned to ensure that revelation would be controlled rather than prevented, managed rather than eliminated. The game was larger than anyone had imagined, and the players were about to discover that they had been pawns in strategies conceived by people whose understanding of power extended far beyond the limited imagination of career bureaucrats who confused authority with competence. The second sniper shot shattered Captain Qureshi's radio antenna with surgical precision, eliminating his ability to communicate with headquarters while leaving his personnel unharmed. The message was unmistakable. Someone wanted the cover-up to proceed without oversight from intelligence officials who might decide that escalation was preferable to exposure. "All units, communications are compromised," Qureshi announced to his team through hand signals, falling back on training that emphasized operational independence when command and control structures failed. His men understood that they were now operating without guidance from superiors who might order actions that served political interests rather than mission success or personnel safety. Major Phillips watched the Pakistani team's communication difficulties, while calculating his own options in a tactical situation that had evolved beyond anyone's ability to control. His satellite communications remained functional, but the conversations he was monitoring between his handlers and Pentagon officials suggested that Washington was as confused about additional players in the valley as the people actually conducting operations. Phoenix Base, Phoenix 6, he transmitted. Unknown sniper is interfering with Pakistani communications. Request clarification of engagement authority regarding non-state actors. The response carried the bureaucratic confusion of officials who were discovering that their carefully planned cover-up had attracted attention from intelligence services that operated beyond the reach of traditional governmental oversight. Phoenix 6, mission parameters unchanged. Complete your objectives and extract immediately. But extraction required coordination that was being systematically eliminated by marksmen who seemed to understand exactly how to disrupt military operations without triggering the massive retaliation that would follow direct attacks on American or Pakistani forces. The snipers were conducting precision interference, surgical strikes against equipment rather than personnel, designed to isolate operational forces while preventing them from completing missions that served interests beyond their understanding. Kestrel recognized the tactical signature of protection details assigned to intelligence assets whose value extended beyond any single operation or revelation. The evidence she had buried was being protected by people who wanted it revealed in controlled circumstances, rather than eliminated through crude violence that would create martyrs and inspire additional investigations. "Major, your extraction isn't coming," she called to Phillips. "Someone wants this evidence to be revealed, but they want to control how and when. You and your men are being isolated, so you can't complete your elimination mission." The implication struck Phillips with the force of betrayal as he understood that his team had been committed to an operation designed to fail, their presence in the valley serving purposes that extended beyond eliminating evidence into creating a spectacle that would focus attention on corruption that needed to be exposed in ways that served additional interests he couldn't identify. Zahir's JF-17 passed over the valley at minimum altitude, his fuel situation now critical, but his commitment to witnessing these events overriding flight safety considerations that should have forced his return to base 20 minutes earlier. Through his canopy, he could see the tactical situation developing in ways that suggested careful orchestration rather than spontaneous military response. "Control, Thunder Lead," he transmitted to his increasingly confused controllers. "I need immediate fuel tanker support to maintain station. Something is happening down here that needs to be documented by reliable witnesses." But the response revealed that Pakistani military leadership was discovering the limits of their authority in operations that had been planned at levels beyond their clearance or understanding. "Thunder Lead, tanker support is not available. You are ordered to return to base immediately." Ordered to return to base, while American and Pakistani forces conducted operations in Pakistani airspace without proper authorization, while unknown snipers eliminated tactical communications, while evidence that could topple governments was being protected by intelligence assets whose existence challenged everything Zahir thought he understood about regional security arrangements. The ancient cairn watched over a convergence of forces that represented the collision between official policy and operational reality, between public statements about democratic values and classified operations that served interests that democracy was never intended to protect. The stones placed by travelers over centuries now marked the intersection of secrets that bound nations together through mutual vulnerability rather than shared principles. Captain Qureshi made the decision that separated career soldiers from political appointees. He chose mission success over institutional loyalty. Using tactical hand signals, he positioned his team to secure the burial site while avoiding engagement with American forces, focusing on evidence recovery rather than personnel elimination. The Pakistani captain had realized that his real mission wasn't eliminating witnesses, but documenting everything for superiors who might need proof of American operations conducted without Pakistani authorization. His team's cameras would record evidence that could be used for diplomatic leverage rather than simple cover-up, transforming potential embarrassment into strategic advantage. The game was changing faster than anyone could adapt, and the players were discovering that they had been committed to operations designed by people whose understanding of power extended far beyond the limited imagination of military officers who confused following orders with serving their nation's interests. In the growing silence that preceded revelation, 3 military forces waited for guidance from superiors who were learning that certain secrets had acquired lives of their own, protected by intelligence assets whose loyalty belonged to interests that transcended national boundaries and extended into spheres of influence that official governments preferred not to acknowledge. The standoff was about to become something else entirely, a carefully orchestrated revelation designed to serve purposes that none of the operational personnel could fully understand. Captain Qureshi's team reached the burial site just as Kestrel stepped back from the cairn, her hands clearly visible while holding a device that every special operations soldier recognized as a dead man's switch. The implications were immediate and terrifying. She had rigged additional evidence for destruction unless specific conditions were met, transforming herself from target into negotiator with the power to deny everyone the intelligence they had risked international incidents to obtain. "Gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying across the valley with the authority of someone who had spent 15 years learning how to survive in conflicts where survival depended on making correct decisions under impossible pressure. "The evidence you're all here to secure or destroy has been uploaded to servers in 7 countries, with instructions to release everything if I don't provide authentication codes every 12 hours. The dead man's switch was psychological rather than physical, but no less effective for being automated rather than manual. Intelligence services around the world would recognize the signature of insurance protocols designed by people who understood that their value lay not in what they knew, but in their ability to control when and how that knowledge was revealed." Major Phillips lowered his weapon completely, recognizing that his elimination mission had become a negotiation where Kestrel held all the strategic advantages while his team remained exposed to unknown snipers and hostile Pakistani forces. "Ma'am, what are your terms?" The question that every intelligence operative learned to ask when operations evolved beyond simple elimination into complex bargaining scenarios, where survival depended on understanding what all parties really wanted, rather than what their official orders claimed to authorize. Kestrel had transformed herself from victim into broker, controlling evidence that multiple governments needed while possessing the power to release information that could destroy careers and topple administrations. "My terms are simple," she replied, her finger remaining near the device that would trigger revelations no intelligence service could contain. "Full amnesty for everyone currently in this valley, complete immunity from prosecution for revealing classified information, and guarantees that the evidence will be investigated by independent authorities rather than buried by the same people who created the corruption it documents." The terms were impossible under current security protocols, but essential for preventing the kind of revelation that would destroy public confidence in institutions that claim to protect democracy, while serving interests that democracy was never intended to benefit. Phillips understood that he was witnessing the intersection of justice and politics, where moral principles collided with practical necessity in ways that transformed heroes into traitors and traitors into heroes, depending on perspective and timing. Captain Qureshi monitored the negotiations while positioning his team to document everything through recording equipment that would provide Pakistani intelligence services with leverage against American officials who had conducted operations without proper authorization. His mission had evolved from elimination to evidence gathering, from cover-up to strategic advantage in diplomatic games that extended far beyond the mountains of Pakistan. Zahir's JF-17s circled overhead with fuel gauges approaching flameout levels, his commitment to witnessing these events now threatening his aircraft and his life as engine temperature readings climbed toward critical thresholds. But he remained on station, understanding that someone needed to provide independent testimony about events that would otherwise be sanitized through official reports that served institutional interests rather than historical accuracy. "Thunder lead to all units," he transmitted on the emergency frequency. "I am declaring myself an official witness to these proceedings under international law. Any hostile action against non-combatants will be reported to appropriate authorities." The Pakistani pilot was invoking protocols that existed in treaties, but were rarely implemented in practice, transforming himself from military asset into legal observer whose testimony would carry weight in international forums, where governments were held accountable for actions they preferred to deny. His presence overhead provided protection for everyone in the valley, while creating legal complications that would prevent simple elimination of inconvenient witnesses. The sound of additional aircraft approaching from multiple directions indicated that news of the standoff had reached higher authorities who were scrambling to contain a situation that threatened to spiral beyond anyone's ability to control. But containment required coordination between American and Pakistani officials who were discovering that their mutual secrets created vulnerability rather than strength, binding them together in cover-ups that served neither nation's interests. Unknown snipers maintained overwatch, while communication intercepts suggested that intelligence assets were managing the revelation to serve interests that extended beyond any single government's authority. The evidence Kestrel had buried was being protected by people who understood that certain truths needed to be revealed in controlled circumstances, rather than suppressed through violence that would create martyrs and inspire additional investigations. The ancient stones of the cairn seemed to pulse with accumulated history as they witnessed another chapter in the endless conflict between power and accountability, between official narratives and operational reality. Travelers had placed these stones over centuries, marking paths through mountains that had seen empires rise and fall while truth and lies battled for dominance in human affairs. In secure conference rooms around the world, officials who had ordered the cover-up were learning that their carefully planned operation had been anticipated and countered by intelligence services, whose capabilities and loyalties remained completely mysterious. The game had multiple players, each pursuing objectives that served interests beyond the limited understanding of career bureaucrats who confused authority with competence. The standoff was approaching its climax, and everyone in the valley understood that the next few minutes would determine whether justice would be served or buried, along with the people who had sacrificed everything to prevent powerful interests from escaping accountability for betrayals that had cost soldiers their lives in service of profits that enriched defense contractors and intelligence officials. The mountain wind carried the sound of approaching helicopters as the final act began. The helicopters that appeared over the eastern ridge bore no national markings, their black paint and electronic signature dampening, suggesting private military contractors operating under contracts that provided plausible deniability for governments who needed certain problems eliminated without official involvement. Their presence transformed the standoff from international incident into something far more dangerous, a conflict between official military forces and intelligence assets, whose loyalty belonged to interests that transcended national boundaries. "All units, unknown aircraft approaching from multiple vectors," Major Phillips transmitted, his tactical display painting threat warnings as sophisticated electronic warfare equipment detected targeting systems more advanced than anything American or Pakistani forces possessed. These aren't government aircraft. The implication struck every soldier in the valley with the force of revelation. They were facing forces that operated beyond governmental oversight, intelligence assets that served corporate and political interests, willing to commit acts of war to protect profits and reputations built on the graves of soldiers who had died believing they were fighting for democracy and freedom. Kestrel recognized the aircraft configuration from classified briefings about private military companies that conducted operations too sensitive for official military forces, contractors who specialized in problems that required permanent solutions without political accountability. Her insurance protocols had anticipated this development, triggering additional revelations that would be released automatically if specific authentication codes weren't provided within narrow time windows. Major, those helicopters belong to people who profit from the conflict's my evidence documents, she called out, her voice carrying across the valley while her finger remained near the dead man's switch. They're here to eliminate everyone who knows too much, including you and your men. The betrayal was complete and devastating. American soldiers had been committed to an operation designed to eliminate evidence of corruption, only to discover that they themselves were considered evidence requiring elimination. Their superiors had sold them to private contractors who would complete the cover-up by ensuring that no official personnel survived to provide testimony about operations that officially never happened. Captain Qureshi's Pakistani forces found themselves allied with American soldiers through the simple expedient of facing common enemies, whose weapons were trained on everyone in the valley, regardless of nationality or original mission. His radio equipment, damaged by sniper fire, suddenly crackled to life, with transmissions from the unknown helicopters demanding immediate surrender of all personnel and evidence. "All ground forces, this is Blackwater Actual," came the transmission, using a call sign that identified one of the most notorious private military companies in the world. "You are interfering with a classified recovery operation. Lay down your weapons and prepare for extraction." Extraction, the euphemism that every intelligence operative understood, meant elimination when applied to operations that required absolute secrecy. The private contractors had been hired to clean up a situation that official forces couldn't handle without creating political complications, transforming potential embarrassment into strategic advantage through the simple expedient of ensuring that no witnesses survive to provide inconvenient testimony. Zahir's JF-17 passed low over the incoming helicopters, his aircraft's identification friend or foe systems detecting electronic signatures that didn't match any known military or civilian aircraft. His fuel situation was now desperate, engine temperature gauges approaching red line levels that indicated imminent flameout. But he continued circling the valley while transmitting continuous updates to Pakistani air traffic control. "Control, Thunder Lead," he broadcast on emergency frequencies monitored by multiple nations' intelligence services. "Unknown private military aircraft are engaging Pakistani and American forces in Pakistani airspace. This is an act of war by non-state actors. Immediate international response is required." The Pakistani pilot was invoking protocols that would trigger diplomatic and military responses from governments around the world, transforming a secret elimination operation into an international incident that would require explanation from officials who preferred their operations to remain completely invisible to public oversight. The first rockets launched from the private military helicopters struck the ridge, where the unknown snipers had established position. Massive explosions that turned rock formations into avalanches designed to eliminate overwatch positions that had been providing protection for the forces in the valley. But the explosions revealed something unexpected. The ridge had been prepared with defensive positions that suggested long-term occupation by people who had anticipated exactly this kind of attack. Return fire came from multiple positions that hadn't appeared on any surveillance system. Heavy weapons that engaged the private military helicopters with professional competence that indicated regular military training and equipment. The valley erupted into combat between forces whose existence challenged everything the operational personnel thought they understood about regional security arrangements. "Jesus Christ," whispered Sergeant Martinez as he watched missile trails crisscross the sky above their position. "There's a whole damn army up there that nobody told us about." The unknown defenders were engaging private military contractors with sophisticated weapons systems, while carefully avoiding any fire that might endanger the official military forces in the valley. Their tactics suggested coordination with intelligence services, whose priorities included protecting evidence rather than eliminating it, revelation rather than cover-up. Kestrel understood before anyone else that they were witnessing the intersection of competing intelligence operations. Shadow wars fought between corporate interests and governmental accountability, between profits built on prolonged conflicts and democratic oversight that threatened those profits by demanding transparency and justice. The battle for truth had become a literal battle, and the mountains that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires were about to host another conflict between power and accountability, between official narratives designed to protect institutional interests and operational reality that served human values no amount of classification could permanently suppress. The ancient cairn stood witness to combat that would determine whether democracy could survive the corruption of its own intelligence services, whether justice could overcome the private armies that served corporate interests disguised as national security. The outcome would determine the future of accountability in democratic nations, and every soldier in the valley understood that they were fighting for principles that extended far beyond their own survival into the fundamental question of whether governments existed to serve their people or to protect the interests that profited from their people's sacrifice. The sound of battle echoed off ancient stones that had marked this place as significant long before modern conflicts over classified information and corporate profits, suggesting that some truths were worth fighting for regardless of the cost in lives and careers, and comfortable illusions about the nature of power in democratic societies. The first private military helicopter fell burning from the sky, struck by missiles fired from positions that hadn't existed on any intelligence assessment, but had been prepared for exactly this contingency. Its wreckage scattered across the valley floor in pieces that would be analyzed by forensic specialists, whose findings would never appear in any official report. Evidence of corporate military operations that governments would deny authorizing, while privately celebrating their elimination of inconvenient accountability. Captain Qureshi watched the helicopter crash while positioning his team to provide covering fire for American soldiers, who had become allies through the simple expedient of facing common enemies. Pakistani and American forces were cooperating without orders, without authorization, without any guidance beyond the recognition that survival required unity against adversaries who served interests that neither democracy nor military honor could accommodate. "Storm elements, provide suppressive fire for American positions," Qureshi ordered, his men responding with professional competence that transcended national boundaries and political considerations in favor of basic military brotherhood that recognized courage regardless of the flag sewn on uniform shoulders. They were soldiers first, politicians never, united by codes of honor that corporate contractors had never learned and intelligence officials had long forgotten. Major Phillips felt profound gratitude as Pakistani bullets provided covering fire for his withdrawal to more defensible positions, evidence that military professionalism could overcome political manipulation when soldiers were allowed to make decisions based on tactical necessity rather than bureaucratic convenience. His men moved with practiced efficiency while returning supporting fire for Pakistani forces, creating temporary alliance that would be denied by both governments while being remembered by every soldier who participated. The unknown defenders on the ridgeline revealed themselves as the battle intensified, their positions and equipment identifying them as elite military personnel operating under contracts that provided services too sensitive for official acknowledgement. They weren't private contractors serving corporate interests. They were intelligence assets protecting operations that served governmental accountability rather than institutional cover-up. Zahir's JF-17 finally succumbed to fuel exhaustion, his engines flaming out at minimum altitude while he guided his aircraft toward the only flat terrain suitable for emergency landing. His ejection seat fired at the last possible moment, parachute deploying just enough to prevent fatal impact while depositing him among soldiers who would provide protection during the investigation that would follow. The Pakistani pilot's aircraft crashed in a ball of fire that painted the valley with orange light and black smoke, but his survival ensured that independent testimony would be available when congressional committees and parliamentary inquiries demanded explanation for events that governments would prefer to deny ever happened. "Thunder Lead is down but alive," he transmitted through his survival radio, his voice reaching air traffic controllers in 3 countries while providing confirmation that qualified military witnesses had observed private military operations conducted without governmental authorization in violation of international law and basic sovereignty principles. The sound of additional aircraft approaching suggested that official military forces were finally responding to reports of private military operations in Pakistani airspace, creating potential for escalation that would expose the entire network of corporate contractors and intelligence officials who had transformed national security into profit opportunities that required permanent elimination of accountability.